Chapter 7: Hippopotamus and Crocodile. Guided by Rabah the party now descended to the edge of the swamp. Here in the shallow water lay 3 boats, or rather rafts, constructed of bundles of bulrushes. They were turned up in front so as to form a sort of swan-necked bow, and in outline were exactly similar to the iron of modern skates. Upon each stood a native with a pole for pushing the rafts along, and 3 or 4 spears. These were of unusual shape, and the lads examined them with curiosity. They had broad short blades, and these were loosely attached to the shafts, so that when the animal was struck the shaft would drop out, leaving the head embedded in its flesh. To the head was attached a cord which was wound up on a spindle passing through a handle. "Those rafts do not look as if they would carry 3," Chebron said. "They will do so at a push," the man replied; "but they are better with 2 only." "I will stop on shore with your permission, Chebron," Jethro said. "I see there are a number of men here with ropes. I suppose they have something to do with the business, and I will accompany them." "The ropes are for hauling the beasts ashore after we have struck them." "Well, I will go and help pull them. I can do my share at that, and should be of no use on one of those little rafts. Indeed, I think that my weight would bury it under the water." "We have been out this morning, my lord," the boatman said, addressing Chebron, "and have found out that there is a river horse lying in a pool a mile up the river. I think he is a large one, and will give us good sport." Chebron and Amuba now took their places on the 2 rafts, and the men, laying down the spears and taking the poles, pushed off from the shore. Noiselessly they made their way among the rushes. Sometimes the channels were so narrow that the reeds almost brushed the rafts on both sides. Then they opened out into wide pools, and here the water deepened so much that the poles could scarce touch the bottom. Not a word was spoken, as the men had warned them that the slightest noise would scare the hippopotami and cause them to sink to the bottom of the pools, where they would be difficult to capture. After half an hour's poling they reached a pool larger than any they had hitherto passed, and extending on one side almost to the bank of the river. The man on his raft now signed to Chebron to take up one of the spears, but the lad shook his head and motioned him to undertake the attack, for he felt that, ignorant as he was of the habits of the animal, it would be folly for him to engage in such an adventure. The man nodded, for he had indeed been doubting as to the course which the affair would take, for it needed a thrust with a very powerful arm to drive the spear through the thick hide of the hippopotamus. Amuba imitated Chebron's example, preferring to be a spectator instead of an actor in this unknown sport. For 3 or 4 minutes the boats lay motionless. Then a blowing sound was heard, and the boatman pointed to what seemed to the boys 2 lumps of black mud projecting an inch or 2 above the water near the margin of the rushes. They could not have believed that these formed part of an animal, but that slight ripples widening out on the glassy water showed that there had been a movement on the spot indicated. With a noiseless push Chebron's hunter sent the boat in that direction, and then handed the end of the pole to Chebron, signing to him to push the boat back when he gave the signal. When within 10 yards of the 2 little black patches there was a sudden movement. They widened into an enormous head, and a huge beast rose to his feet, startled at the discovery he had just made that men were close at hand. In an instant the hunter hurled his spear with all his force. Tough as was the animal's hide, the sharp head cut its way through. With a roar the beast plunged into the rushes, the shaft of the spear falling out of its socket as it did so, and the strong cord ran out rapidly from the reel held by the hunter. Presently the strain ceased. "He has laid down again in shelter," the hunter said. "We will now follow him and give him a second spear." Pushing the rushes aside the boat was forced along until they again caught sight of the hippopotamus, that was standing up to its belly in water. "Is he going to charge?" Chebron asked, grasping a spear. "No, there is little chance of that. Should he do so and upset the boat, throw yourself among the rushes and lie there with only your face above water. I will divert his attention and come back and get you into the boat when he has made off." Another spear was thrown with good effect. There was a roar and a great splash. Chebron thought that the animal was upon them, but he turned off and dashed back to the pool where he had been first lying. "I thought that was what he would do," the hunter said. "They always seek shelter in the bottom of the deep pools, and here you see the water is not deep enough to cover him." The boat again followed the hippopotamus. Amuba was still on his raft on the pool. "What has become of him?" Chebron asked as they passed beyond the rushes. "He has sunk to the bottom of the pool," Amuba replied. "He gave me a start, I can tell you. We heard him bursting through the rushes, and then he rushed out with his mouth open, a mouth like a cavern, and then, just as I thought he was going to charge us, he turned off and sank to the bottom of the pool." "How long will he lie there?" Chebron asked the hunter.
"A long time if he is left to himself, but we are going to stir him up."
So saying, he directed the boat toward the rushes nearest to the bank and pushed the boat through them. "Oh, here you are, Jethro," Chebron said, seeing the Rebu and the men he had accompanied standing on the bank. "What has happened, Chebron? Have you killed one of them? We heard a sort of roar and a great splashing." "We have not killed him, but there are two spearheads sticking into him." The hunter handed the cords to the men and told them to pull steadily, but not hard enough to break the cords. Then he took from them the end of the rope they carried and pulled back into the pool. "Those cords are not strong enough to pull the great beast to the shore, are they?" Chebron asked.
"Oh, no, they would not move him; but by pulling on them it causes the spearheads to give him pain. He gets uneasy and rises to the surface in anger. Then, you see, I throw this noose over his head, and they can pull upon that." In 2 or 3 minutes the animal's head appeared above the water. The instant it did so the hunter threw the noose. The aim was correct, and with a jerk he tightened it round the neck. "Now pull!" he shouted. The peasants pulled, and gradually the hippopotamus was drawn toward the bank, although struggling to swim in the opposite direction. As soon, however, as he reached the shallow water and his feet touched the ground he threw his whole weight upon the rope. The peasants were thrown to the ground and the rope dragged through their fingers as the hippopotamus again made his way to the bottom of the pool. The peasants regained their feet and pulled on the rope and cords. Again the hippopotamus rose and was dragged to the shallow, only to break away again. For 8 or 10 times this happened. "He is getting tired now," the hunter said. "Next time or the time after they will get him on shore. We will land then and attack him with spears and arrows."
The hippopotamus was indeed exhausted, and allowed itself to be dragged ashore at the next effort without opposition. As soon as it did so he was attacked with spears by the hunters, Jethro, and the boys. The latter found that they were unable to drive their weapons through the thick skin, and betook themselves to their bows and arrows. The hunters, however, knew the points at which the skin was thinnest, and drove their spears deep into the animal just behind the foreleg, while the boys shot their arrows at its mouth. Another noose had been thrown over its head as it issued from the water, and the peasants pulling on the ropes prevented it from charging. 3 or 4 more thrusts were given from the hunters, then one of the spears touched a vital part. The hippopotamus sank on its knees and rolled over dead. The peasants sent up a shout of joy, for the flesh of the hippopotamus is by no means bad eating, and here was a store of food sufficient for the whole neighborhood.
"Shall we search for another, my lord?"
the hunter asked Chebron. "No, I think I have had enough of this. There is no fun in killing an animal that has not spirit to defend itself. What do you think, Amuba?" "I quite agree with you, Chebron. One might almost as well slaughter a cow. What is that?" he exclaimed suddenly as a loud scream was heard at a short distance away. "It is a woman's voice." Chebron darted off in full speed in the direction of the sound, closely followed by Amuba and Jethro. They ran about 100 yards along the bank when they saw the cause of the outcry. An immense crocodile was making his way toward the river, dragging along with it the figure of a woman. In spite of his reverence for the crocodile Chebron did not hesitate a moment, but rushing forward smote the crocodile on the nose with all his strength with the shaft of his spear. The crocodile dropped its victim and turned upon its assailant, but Jethro and Amuba were close behind, and these also attacked him. The crocodile, seeing this accession of enemies, now set out for the river, snapping its jaws together.
"Mind its tail!"
one of the hunters exclaimed, running up. But the warning was too late, for the next moment Amuba received a tremendous blow which sent him to the ground. The hunter at the same moment plunged his spear into the animal through the soft skin at the back of its leg. Jethro followed his example on the other side. The animal checked its flight, and turning round and round lashed with its tail in all directions.
"Keep clear of it!" the hunter shouted. "It is mortally wounded and will need no more blows."
In fact, the crocodile had received its death wound. Its movements became more languid, it ceased to lash its tail, though it still snapped at those nearest to it, but gradually this action also ceased, its head sank, and it was dead. Jethro as soon as he had delivered his blow ran to Amuba.
"Are you hurt?"
he asked anxiously. "No, I don't think so," Amuba gasped. "The brute has knocked all the breath out of my body, but that's better than if he had hit me in the leg, for I think he would have broken it had he done so. How is the woman? Is she dead?"
"I have not had time to see," Jethro replied. "Let me help you to your feet, and let us see if any of your ribs are broken. I will see about her afterward."
Amuba, on getting up, declared that he did not think he was seriously hurt, although unable for the time to stand upright. "I expect I am only bruised, Jethro. It was certainly a tremendous whack he gave me, and I expect I shall not be able to take part in any sporting for the next few days. The crocodile was worth a dozen hippopotami. There was some courage about him." They now walked across to Chebron, who was stooping over the figure of the crocodile's victim. "Why, she is but a girl!" Amuba exclaimed. "She is no older than your sister, Chebron." "Do you think she is dead?" Chebron asked in hushed tones.
"I think she has only fainted," Jethro replied. "Here!" he shouted to one of the peasants who were gathered round the crocodile. "One of you run down to the water and bring up a gourd full."
"I don't think she is dead," Amuba said. "It seemed to me that the crocodile had seized her by the leg."
"We must carry her somewhere," Jethro said, "and get some woman to attend to her. I will see if there is a hut near."
He sprang up to the top of some rising ground and looked round.
"There is a cottage close at hand," he said as he returned. "I dare say she belongs there."
Bidding two of the peasants run to fetch some women, he lifted up the slight figure and carried her up the slope, the two lads following. On turning round the foot of a sand hill they saw a cottage lying nestled behind it. It was neater and better kept than the majority of the huts of the peasants. The walls of baked clay had been whitewashed and were half covered with bright flowers. A patch of carefully cultivated ground lay around it. Jethro entered the cottage. On a settle at the further end a man was sitting. He was apparently of great age. His hair and long beard were snowy white.
"What is it?" he exclaimed as Jethro entered. "Has the God of our fathers again smitten me in my old age, and taken from me my pet lamb? I heard her cry, but my limbs have lost their power, and I could not rise to come to her aid." "I trust that the child is not severely injured," Jethro said. "We had just killed a hippopotamus when we heard her scream, and running up found a great crocodile dragging her to the river, but we soon made him drop her. I trust that she is not severely hurt. The beast seemed to us to have seized her by the leg. We have sent to fetch some women. Doubtless they will be here immediately. Ah, here's the water."
He laid the girl down upon a couch in the corner of the room, and taking the gourd from the peasant who had brought it sprinkled some water on her face, while Amuba by his direction rubbed her hands. It was some minutes before she opened her eyes, and just as she did so two women entered the hut. Leaving the girl to their care, Jethro and the boys left the cottage. "I trust that the little maid is not greatly hurt," Amuba said. "By her dress it seems to me that she is an Israelite, though I thought we had left their land behind us on the other side of the desert. Still, her dress resembles those of the women we saw in the village as we passed. And it is well for her it does so, for they wear more and thicker garments than the Egyptian peasant women, and the brute's teeth may not have torn her severely." In a few minutes one of the women came out and told them that the maid had now recovered and that she was almost unhurt. "The crocodile seems to have seized her by her garments rather than her flesh, and although the teeth have bruised her, the skin is unbroken. Her grandfather would fain thank you for the service you have rendered him." They re-entered the cottage. The girl was sitting on the ground at her grandfather's feet holding one of his hands in hers, while with his other he was stroking her head. As they entered, the women, seeing that their services were no longer required, left the cottage.
"Who are those to whom I owe the life of my grandchild?"
the old man asked. "I am Chebron, the son of Ameres, the high priest of the temple of Osiris at Thebes. These are my friends Amuba and Jethro, two of the Rebu nation who were brought to Egypt and now live in my father's household." "We are his servants," Amuba said, "though he is good enough to call us his friends."
"'Tis strange," the old man said, "that the son of a priest of Osiris should thus come to gladden the last few hours of one who has always withstood the Egyptian gods. And yet had the crocodile carried off my Ruth, it would have been better for her, seeing that ere the sun has risen and set many times she will be alone in the world."
The girl uttered a little cry, and rising on her knees threw her arms round the old man's neck.
"It must be so, my Ruth. I have lived 110 years in this land of the heathen, and my course is run; and were it not for your sake I should be glad that it is so, for my life has been sorrow and bitterness. I call her my grandchild, but she is in truth the daughter of my grandchild, and all who stood between her and me have passed away before me, and left us alone together. But she trusts in the God of Abraham, and he will raise up a protector for her."
Chebron, who had learned something of the traditions of the Israelites dwelling in Egypt, saw by the old man's words that Jethro's surmises were correct and that he belonged to that race. "You are an Israelite," he said gently. "How is it that you are not dwelling among your people instead of alone among strangers?"
"I left them 30 years back when Ruth's mother was but a tottering child. They would not suffer me to dwell in peace among them, but drove me out because I testified against them."
"Because you testified against them?" Chebron repeated in surprise.
"Yes, my father was already an old man when I was born, and he was one of the few who still clung to the faith of our fathers. He taught me that there was but one God, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, and that all other gods were but images of wood and stone. To that faith I clung, though after a while I alone of all our people held to the belief. The others had forgotten their God and worshipped the gods of the Egyptians. When I would speak to them they treated my words as ravings and as casting dishonor on the gods they served. My sons went with the rest, but my daughter learned the true faith from my lips and clung to it. She taught her daughter after her, and 10 years ago, when she too lay dying, she sent Ruth by a messenger to me, praying me to bring her up in the faith of our fathers, and saying that though she knew I was of a great age, she doubted not that when my time came God would raise up protectors for the child. So for 10 years we have dwelt here together, tilling and watering our ground and living on its fruit and by the sale of baskets that we weave and exchange for fish with our neighbors. The child worships the God of our fathers, and has grown and thriven here for 10 years. But my heart is heavy at the thought that my hours are numbered, and that I see no way after me but that Ruth shall return to our people, who will assuredly in time wean her from her faith."
"Never, grandfather," the girl said firmly. "They may beat me and persecute me, but I will never deny my God."
"They are hard people, the Israelites," the old man said, shaking his head, "and they are stubborn and must needs prevail against one so tender. However, all matters are in the hands of God, who will again reveal himself in his due time to his people who have forgotten him."
Amuba, looking at the girl, thought that she had more power of resistance than the old man gave her credit for. Her face was of the same style of beauty as that of some of the young women he had seen in the villages of the Israelites, but of a higher and finer type. Her face was almost oval, with soft black hair, and delicately marked eyebrows running almost in a straight line below her forehead. Her eyes were large and soft, with long lashes veiling them, but there was a firmness about the lips and chin that spoke of a determined will and gave strength to her declaration, "Never!" There was silence a moment, and then Chebron said almost timidly: "My father, although high priest of Osiris, is not a bigot in his religion. He is wise and learned, and views all things temperately, as my friends here can tell you. He knows of your religion, for I have heard him say that when they first came into this land the Israelites worshipped one God only. I have a sister who is of about the same age as Ruth, and is gentle and kind. I am sure that if I ask my father he will take your grandchild into his household to be a friend and companion to Mysa, and I am certain that he would never try to shake her religion, but would let her worship as she chooses." The old man looked fixedly at Chebron. "Your speech is pleasant and kind, young sir, and your voice has an honest ring. A few years back I would have said that I would rather the maiden were dead than a handmaid in the house of an Egyptian, but as death approaches we see things differently, and it may be that she would be better there than among those who once having known the true God have forgotten him and taken to the worship of idols. I have always prayed and believed that God would raise up protectors for Ruth, and it seems to me now that the way you have been brought hither in these latter days of my life is the answer to my prayer. Ruth, my child, you have heard the offer, and it is for you to decide. Will you go with this young Egyptian lord and serve his sister as a handmaiden, or will you return to the villages of our people?" Ruth had risen to her feet now, and was looking earnestly at Chebron, then her eyes turned to the faces of Amuba and Jethro, and then slowly went back again to Chebron. "I believe that God has chosen for me," she said at last, "and has sent them here not only to save my life, but to be protectors to me. Their faces are all honest and good. If the father of this youth will receive me, I will, when you leave me, go and be the handmaid of his daughter."
"It is well," the old man said. "Now I am ready to depart, for my prayers have been heard. May God deal with you and yours, Egyptian, even as you deal with my child."
"May it be so," Chebron replied reverently.
"I can tell you," Jethro said to the old man, "that in no household in Egypt could your daughter be happier than in that of Ameres. He is the lord and master of Amuba and myself, and yet, as you see, his son treats us not as servants, but as friends. Ameres is one of the kindest of men, and as to his daughter Mysa, whose special attendant I am, I would lay down my life to shield her from harm. Your grandchild could not be in better hands. As to her religion, although Ameres has often questioned Amuba and myself respecting the gods of our people, he has never once shown the slightest desire that we should abandon them for those of Egypt."
"And now," Chebron said, "we will leave you, for doubtless the excitement has wearied you, and Ruth needs rest and quiet after her fright. We are encamped a mile away near the lake, and will come and see you tomorrow." Not a word was spoken for some time after they left the house, and then Chebron said: "It really would almost seem as if what that old man said was true, and that his God had sent us there that a protector might be found for his daughter. It was certainly strange that we should happen to be within sound of her voice when she was seized by that crocodile, and be able to rescue her just in time. It needed, you see, first, that we should be there, then that the crocodile should seize her at that moment, and lastly that we should be just in time to save her being dragged into the river. A crocodile might have carried her away 10,000 times without anyone being within reach to save her, and the chances were enormously against anyone who did save her being in a position to offer her a suitable home at her grandfather's death. It is certainly strange. You do not think that your father will have any objection to take her?" Amuba asked. "Oh, no. He may say that he does not want any more servants in the house, but I am sure that when he sees her he will be pleased to have such a companion for Mysa. If it was my mother, I do not know. Most likely she would say no, but when she hears that it has all been settled, she will not trouble one way or the other about it. I will write my father a letter telling him all about it, and send off one of the slaves with it at once. He can get back tomorrow, and it will gladden the old man's heart to know that it is all arranged. I wish to tell my father, too, of my trouble." "What trouble?" Amuba asked in surprise. "You have told me nothing about anything troubling you." "Do you not understand, Amuba? I am in trouble because I struck the crocodile. It is an impious action, and yet what could I do?" Amuba repressed an inclination to smile. "You could do nothing else, Chebron, for there was no time to mince matters. He was going too fast for you to explain to him that he was doing wrong in carrying off a girl, and you therefore took the only means in your power of stopping him. Besides, the blow you dealt him did him no injury whatever. It was Jethro and the hunter who killed him. But had I not delayed his flight they could not have done so." "That is true enough, Chebron, but in that case he would have reached the water with his burden and devoured her at his leisure. Unless you think that his life is of much more importance than hers, I cannot see that you have anything to reproach yourself with." "You do not understand me, Amuba," Chebron said pettishly. "Of course I do not think that the life of an ordinary animal is of as much importance as that of a human being, but the crocodiles are sacred, and misfortune falls upon those who injure them." "Then in that case, Chebron, misfortune must fall very heavily on the inhabitants of those districts where the crocodile is killed wherever he is found. I have not heard that pestilence and famine visit those parts of Egypt with more frequency than they do the districts where the crocodile is venerated." Chebron made no answer. What Amuba said was doubtless true, but upon the other hand, he had always been taught that the crocodile was sacred, and if so he could not account for the impunity with which these creatures were destroyed in other parts of Egypt. It was another of the puzzles that he so constantly met with. After a long pause he replied: "It may seem to be as you say, but you see, Amuba, there are some gods specially worshipped in one district, others in another. In the district that a god specially protects he would naturally be indignant were the animals sacred to him to be slain, while he might pay no heed to the doings in those parts in which he is little concerned. In that case, Chebron, you can clearly set your mind at rest. Let us allow that it is wrong to kill a crocodile in the district in which he is sacred and where a god is concerned about his welfare, but that no evil consequences can follow the slaying of him in districts in which he is not sacred, and where his god, as you say, feels little interest in him. I hope that it is so, Amuba, and that as the crocodile is not a sacred animal here no harm may come from my striking one, though I would give much that I had not been obliged to do so. I hope that my father will regard the matter in the same light." "I have no doubt that he will do so, Chebron, especially as we agreed that you did no real harm to the beast." "Is it not strange, Jethro," Amuba said when Chebron had gone into the tent, "that wise and learned people like the Egyptians should be so silly regarding animals?"
"It is strange, Amuba, and it was hard to keep from laughing to hear you so gravely arguing the question with Chebron. If all the people held the same belief I should not be surprised; but as almost every animal worshipped in one of the districts is hated and slain in another, and that without any evil consequences arising, one would have thought that they could not but see for themselves the folly of their belief. What are we going to do tomorrow?"
"I do not think that it is settled. We have had one day at each of the sports. Rabah said that tomorrow we could either go out and see new modes of fishing, or accompany the fowlers and watch them catching birds in the clap nets, or go out into the desert and hunt ibex. Chebron did not decide, but I suppose when he has finished his letter we shall hear what he intends to do."
After Chebron had finished his letter, which was a long one, he called Rabah and asked him to dispatch it at once by the fleetest footed of the slaves.
"He will get there," he said, "before my father retires to rest. If he does not reply at once he will probably answer in the morning, and at any rate the man ought to be back before midday." At dinner Amuba asked Chebron whether he had decided what they should do the next day. "We might go and look at the men with the clap nets," Chebron answered. "They have several sorts in use, and take numbers of pigeons and other birds. I think that will be enough for tomorrow. We have had 4 days' hard work, and a quiet day will be pleasant; and if we find the time goes slowly we can take a boat across the lake and look at the great sea beyond the sand hills that divide the lake from it. Beside, I hope we shall get my father's answer, and I should like some further talk with that old Israelite. It is interesting to learn about the religion that his forefathers believed in, and in which it seems that he and his grandchild are now the last who have faith." "It will suit me very well to have a quiet day, Chebron, for in any case I do not think I could have accompanied you. My ribs are sore from the whack the crocodile gave me with his tail, and I doubt whether I shall be able to walk tomorrow."
Indeed, the next morning Amuba was so stiff and sore that he was unable to rise from his couch. Soon after breakfast the messenger returned, bringing a letter from Ameres. It was as follows: "It seems to me, Chebron, that Mysa has no occasion for further attendance; but as your story of this old Israelite and his daughter interests me, and the girl is of Mysa's age and might be a pleasant companion for her, I have no objection to her entering our household. I should have liked to talk with the old man himself, and to have heard from him more about the religion that Joseph and his people brought to Egypt. It is recorded in some of the scrolls that these people were monotheists, but although I have many times questioned Israelites, all have professed to be acquainted with no religion but that of Egypt. If you have further opportunity find out as much as you can from this old man upon the subject. Assure him from me that his daughter shall be kindly treated in my household, and that no attempt whatever will be made to turn her from the religion she professes. As to your adventure with the crocodile, I do not think that your conscience need trouble you. It would certainly be unfortunate to meet in Upper Egypt a crocodile carrying off a peasant, and I am not called upon to give an opinion as to what would be the proper course to pursue under the circumstances; but as you are at present in a district where the crocodile, instead of being respected, is held in detestation, and as the people with you would probably have overtaken and slain him even without your intervention, I do not think that you need trouble yourself about the knock that you gave him across his snout. Had I found myself in the position you did I should probably have taken the same course. With respect to the girl, you had best give them instructions that when the old man dies she shall travel by boat to Thebes. Arrived there she will find no difficulty in learning which is my house, and on presenting herself there she will be well received. I will write at once to Mysa, telling her that you have found a little Israelite handmaiden as her special attendant, and that, should the girl arrive before my return, she is at once to assume that position. It would not do for her to come here were her grandfather to die before we leave for home. In the first place she would be in the way, and in the second her features and dress would proclaim her to be an Israelite. The people in the villages she passed through might detain her, and insist on her remaining with them; or, should she arrive here, the fact of her departing with us might be made a subject of complaint, and the Israelites would not improbably declare that I had carried off a young woman of their tribe as a slave. Therefore, in all respects, it is better that she should proceed up the river to Thebes. As they are poor, you had best leave a sum of money with them to pay for her passage by boat, and for her support during the voyage. I find that I shall have finished with the steward earlier than I had expected, and shall be starting in about 3 days to inspect the canals and lay out plans for some fresh ones. Therefore, if by that time you have had enough sport to satisfy you, you had best journey back."
"My father has consented," Chebron said joyously as he finished the letter. "I felt sure that he would. Still I was anxious till I got the letter, for it would have been a great disappointment to the old man could it not have been managed. I will go off and tell him at once. I shall not want you this morning, Jethro, so you can either stay here with Amuba or do some fishing or fowling on the lake. The boat is all in readiness, you know." Chebron went off to the cottage. Ruth was in the garden tending the vegetables, and he stopped to speak to her before entering. "I have not heard yet," he said, "how it came about that you were seized by the crocodile." "I hardly know how it was," she said. "I am in the habit of going down many times a day to fetch up water for the garden, and I always keep a lookout for these creatures before I fill my jar. But yesterday I had just gone round the corner of the sandhill when I was struck down with a tremendous blow, and a moment afterward the creature seized me. I gave a scream, but I thought I was lost, for there are no neighbors within the sound of the voice, and my grandfather has not been able to walk for months. Then I prayed as well as I could for the pain, and God heard me and sent you to deliver me." "It is not often that they go up so far from the river, is it?" "Not often; but yesterday we had a portion of a kid from a neighbor and were cooking it, and perhaps the smell attracted the crocodile, for they say that they are quick at smell, and they have been known to go into cottages and carry off meat from before the fire." "I see you walk very lame still." "Yes, grandfather would have me keep still for a day or two, but I think that as soon as the bruises die out and the pain ceases I shall be as well as ever. Beside, what would the garden do without water? My grandfather will be glad to see you, my lord, but he is rather more feeble than usual this morning. The excitement of yesterday has shaken him." She led the way into the cottage. "Your granddaughter has told me you are not very strong today," Chebron began.
"At my age," the old man said, "even a little thing upsets one, and the affair of yesterday was no little thing. I wonder much that the agitation did not kill me."
"I have satisfactory news to give you," Chebron said. "I yesterday dispatched a message to my father, and have just received the answer." And taking out the scroll he read aloud the portion in which Ameres stated his readiness to receive Ruth in his household, and his promise that no pressure whatever should be put upon her to abandon her religion.
"The Lord be praised!" the old man exclaimed. "The very animals are the instruments of his will, and the crocodile that threatened death to the child was, in truth, the answer sent to my prayer. I thank you, my young lord, and as you and yours deal with my child, so may the God of my fathers deal with you. But she may stay on with me for the little time that remains, may she not?"
"Surely. We should not think of taking her now. My father sends instructions as to what she is to do, and money to pay for her journey up the Nile to Thebes. This is what he says," and he read the portion of the scroll relating to the journey. "And now," he said, "let me read to you what my father says about your religion. He is ever a searcher after truth, and would fain that I should hear from your lips and repeat to him all that you can tell me relating to this God whom you worship."
"That will I with gladness, my young lord. The story is easily told, for it is simple, and not like that of your religion with its many deities."
Chebron took a seat upon a pile of rushes and prepared to listen to the old man's story of the God of the Israelites. Chapter 8: The Conspiracy in the Temple. For 2 days longer the party lingered by the side of the lake fishing and fowling, and then returned across the desert to the headquarters of Immerse. 2 months were spent in examining canals and watercourses, seeing that the dikes were strengthened where needed, and that the gates and channels were in good repair. Levels were taken for the construction of several fresh branches, which would considerably extend the margin of cultivation. The natives were called upon to furnish a supply of labor for their formation, but the quota was not furnished without considerable grumbling on the part of the Israelites, although Ameres announced that payment would be given them for their work. At last, having seen that everything was in train, Ameres left one of his subordinates to carry out the work, and then started with his son for Thebes. A fortnight after his return home he was informed that a young female, who said her name was Ruth, wished to see him. He bade the servant conduct her to him, and at the same time summoned Chebron from his studies. The lad arrived first, and as Ruth entered presented her to his father. "Welcome, child, to this house," the high priest said. "I suppose by your coming that the old man, your great-grandfather, of whom my son has spoken to me, is no more?" "He died a month since, my lord," Ruth replied; "but it was 2 weeks before I could find a passage in a boat coming hither." "Chebron, tell Mysa to come here," Ameres said, and the lad at once fetched Mysa, who had already heard that an Israelite girl was coming to be her special attendant, and had been much interested in Chebron's account of her and her rescue from the crocodile. "This is Ruth, Mysa," Ameres said when she entered, "who has come to be with you. She has lost her last friend, and I need not tell you, my child, to be kind and considerate with her. You know what you would suffer were you to be placed among strangers, and how lonely you would be at first. She will be a little strange to our ways, but you will soon make her at home, I hope." "I will try and make her happy," Mysa replied, looking at her new companion. Although the girls were about the same age, Ruth looked the elder of the two. Mysa was still little more than a child, full of fun and life. Ruth was broken down by the death of her grandfather and by the journey she had made, but in any case she would have looked older than Mysa, the difference being in manner rather than in face or figure. Ruth had long had many responsibilities on her shoulders. There was the care and nursing of the old man, the cultivation of the garden on which their livelihood depended, the exchange of its products for other articles, the preparation of the meals. Her grandfather had been in the habit of talking to her as a grown-up person, and there was an expression of thoughtfulness and gravity in her eyes. Mysa, on the contrary, was still but a happy child, who had never known the necessity for work or exertion. Her life had been like a summer day, free from all care and anxiety. Naturally, then, she felt as she looked at Ruth that she was a graver and more serious personage than she had expected to see. "I think I shall like you," she said, when her examination was finished, "when we know each other a little better; and I hope you will like me, because, as my father says, we are to be together." "I am sure we shall," Ruth replied, looking admiringly at Mysa's bright face. "I have never had anything to do with girls of my own age, and you will find me clumsy at first; but I will do my best to please you, for your father and brother have been very good to me." "There, take her away, Mysa. I have told your mother about her coming, and want to go on with my reading," Ameres said. "Show her your garden and animals, and where she is to sleep, and give her in charge of old Male, who will see that she has all she wants, and get suitable garments and all that is requisite." Before many days were over Ruth had become quite at home in her new abode. Her position was a pleasant one. She was at once companion and attendant to Mysa, accompanying her in her walks under the escort of Jethro, playing with her in the garden, helping her to feed the animals, and amusing her when she preferred to sit quiet by telling her about her life near the lake by the Great Sea, about the fowling and fishing there, and especially about the river course close to the cottage, with its hippopotami and crocodiles. Ruth brightened up greatly in her new surroundings, which to her were marvelous and beautiful, and she soon caught something of the cheerfulness of her young mistress, and the laughter of the two girls was often heard rising from Mysa's inclosure at the further end of the quiet garden. Shortly after the return from their visit to Lower Egypt an important event took place, Chebron being initiated into the lowest grade of the priesthood. His duties at first were slight, for aspirants to the higher order, who were with scarce an exception the sons of the superior priesthood, were not expected to perform any of the drudgery that belonged properly to the work of the lower class of the order. It was necessary to ascend step by step, but until they arrived at the grade beyond which study and intelligence alone led to promotion, their progress was rapid, and they were expected only to take part in such services and ceremonies of the temple as required the attendance of all attached to it. His duties therefore interfered but little with his studies or ordinary mode of life, and he was almost as much at home as before. He could now, however, enter the temple at all hours, and had access to the inner courts and chambers, the apartments where the sacred animals were kept, and other places where none but the priests were permitted to enter. He availed himself of this privilege chiefly of an evening. All the great courts were open to the sky, and Chebron loved to roam through them in the bright moonlight, when they were deserted by the crowd of worshipers and all was still and silent. At that time the massive columns, the majestic architecture, the strange figures of the gods exercised an influence upon his imagination which was wanting in the daytime. Upon the altars before the chief gods fire ever burned, and in the light of the flickering flames the faces assumed life and expression. Now and then a priest in his white linen robe moved through the deserted courts, but for the most part Chebron had undisturbed possession and was free to meditate without interruption. He found that his mind was then attuned to a pitch of reverence and devotion to the gods that it failed to attain when the sun was blazing down upon the marble floor and the courts were alive with worshipers. Then, strive as he would, he could not enter as he wanted into the spirit of the scene. When he walked in the solemn procession carrying a sacred vessel or one of the sacred emblems, doubts whether there could be anything in common between the graven image and the god it represented would occur to him. He would wonder whether the god was really gratified by these processions, whether he felt any real pleasure in the carrying about of sacred vessels, emblems, and offerings of flowers. He was shocked at his own doubts, and did his best to banish them from his mind. At times it seemed to him that some heavy punishment must fall upon him for permitting himself to reason on matters so far beyond his comprehension, and he now rejoiced at what he before was inclined to regret, that his father had decided against his devoting his whole life to the service of the temple. Sometimes he thought of speaking to his father and confessing to him that his mind was troubled with doubts, but the thought of the horror with which such a confession would be received deterred him from doing so. Even to Amuba he was silent on the subject, for Amuba, he thought, would not understand him. His friend believed firmly in the gods of his own country, but accepted the fact that the Egyptian deities were as powerful for good or evil to the Egyptians as were his own to the Rebu. And indeed, the fact that the Egyptians were so great and powerful and prevailed over other nations was, he was inclined to think, due to the superior power of their gods. The majesty of the temples, the splendor of the processions, and the devoutness with which the people worshiped their gods alike impressed him, and although the strangeness of the images struck him as singular, he was ready to admit that the gods might take any shape they pleased. Thus, then, Chebron could look for no sympathy from him, and shrank from opening his mind to him. Nevertheless he sometimes took Amuba with him in his visits to the temple. The doors at all times stood open, and any could enter who chose, and had they in the inner courts met with any of the priests, Amuba would have passed unnoticed as being one of the attendants of the temple in company with Chebron. But few words were exchanged between the lads during these rambles, for the awful grandeur of the silent temple and its weird aspect in the moonlight affected Amuba as strongly as it did Chebron. At times he wondered to himself whether if he ever returned home and were to introduce the worship of these terrible gods of Egypt, they would extend their protection to the Rebu. Near the house of Ameres stood that of Ptylus, a priest who occupied a position in the temple of Osiris next in dignity to that of the high priest. Between the two priests there was little cordiality, for they differed alike in disposition and manner of thought. Ptylus was narrow and bigoted in his religion, precise in every observance of ceremonial, austere and haughty in manner, professing to despise all learning beyond that relating to religion, but secretly devoured with jealousy at the esteem in which Ameres was held by the court, and his reputation as one of the first engineers, astronomers, and statesmen of Egypt. He had been one of the fiercest in the opposition raised to the innovations proposed by Ameres, and had at the time exerted himself to the utmost to excite such a feeling against him as would render it necessary for him to resign his position in the temple. His disappointment had been intense when, owing in no slight degree to the influence of the king himself, who regarded Ameres with too much trust and affection to allow himself to be shaken in his confidence even by what he held to be the erroneous views of the high priest of Osiris, his intrigue came to nothing, but he had ever since kept an unceasing watch upon the conduct of his colleague, without, however, being able to find the slightest pretense for a complaint against him. For Ameres was no visionary, and having failed in obtaining a favorable decision as to the views he entertained, he had not striven against the tide, knowing that by doing so he would only involve himself and his family in ruin and disgrace without forwarding in the smallest degree the opinions he held. He was thus as exact as ever in his ministration in the temple, differing only from the other performers of the sacred rites inasmuch as while they offered their sacrifices to Osiris himself, he in his heart dedicated his offerings to the great god of whom Osiris was but a feeble type or image. A certain amount of intimacy was kept up between the two families, although there was no more liking between the wives of the two priests than between their husbands. They were of similar dispositions, both were fond of show and gaiety, both were ambitious, and although in society both exhibited to perfection the somewhat gentle and indolent manner which was considered to mark high breeding among the women of Egypt, the slaves of both knew to their cost that in their own homes their bearing was very different. In their entertainments and feasts there was constant rivalry between them, although the wife of the high priest considered it nothing short of insolence that the wife of one inferior to her husband's rank should venture to compete with her, while upon the other hand the little airs of calm superiority her rival assumed when visiting her excited the deepest indignation and bitterness in the heart of the wife of Ptylus. She too was aware of the enmity that her husband bore to Ameres, and did her best to second him by shaking her head and affecting an air of mystery whenever his name was mentioned, leaving her friends to suppose that did she choose she could tell terrible tales to his disadvantage. Ameres on his part had never alluded at home either to his views concerning religion or to his difference of opinion with his colleagues. There was but little in common between him and his wife. He allowed her liberty to do as she chose, to give frequent entertainments to her female friends, and to spend money as she liked so long as his own mode of life was not interfered with. He kept in his own hands, too, the regulation of the studies of Chebron and Mysa. One day when he was in his study his wife entered. He looked up with an expression of remonstrance, for it was an understood thing that when occupied with his books he was on no account to be disturbed except upon business of importance.
"You must not mind my disturbing you for once, Ameres, but an important thing has happened. Nicotis, the wife of Ptylus, has been here this afternoon, and what do you think she was the bearer of? A proposal from her husband and herself that their son Plexo should marry our Mysa."
Ameres uttered an exclamation of surprise and anger.
"She is a child at present. The thing is ridiculous." "Not so much a child, Ameres, after all. She is nearer 15 than 14, and betrothal often takes place a year earlier. I have been thinking for some time of talking the matter over with you, for it is fully time that we thought of her future."
Ameres was silent. What his wife said was perfectly true, and Mysa had reached the age at which the Egyptian maidens were generally betrothed. It came upon him, however, as an unpleasant surprise. He had regarded Mysa as still a child, and his affections were centered in her and Chebron. For his eldest son, who resembled his mother in spirit, he had but little affection or sympathy.
"Very well," he
said at last in a tone of irritation very unusual to him.
"If Mysa has reached the age when we must begin to think whom she is to marry, we will think of it, but there is no occasion whatever for haste. As to Plexo, I have marked him often when he has been here with Chebron, and I do not like his disposition. He is arrogant and overbearing, and at the same time shallow and foolish. Such is not the kind of youth to whom I shall give Mysa."
The answer did not quite satisfy his wife. She agreed with him in objecting to the proposed alliance, but on entirely different grounds. She had looked forward to Mysa making a brilliant match, which would add to her own consequence and standing. On ceremonial occasions, as the wife of the high priest, and herself a priestess of Osiris, she was present at all the court banquets; but the abstemious tastes and habits of Ameres prevented her from taking the part she desired in other festivities, and she considered that were Mysa to marry some great general, or perhaps even one of the princes of the blood, she would then be able to take that position in society to which she aspired, and considered, indeed, that she ought to fill as the wife of Ameres, high priest of Osiris, and one of the most trusted counselors of the king. Such result would certainly not flow from Mysa's marriage to the son of one of less rank in the temple than her husband, and far inferior in public estimation. Being content, however, that her husband objected to the match on other grounds, she abstained from pressing her own view of the subject, being perfectly aware that it was one with which Ameres would by no means sympathize. She therefore only said: "I am glad that you object to the match, Ameres, and am quite in accord with you in your opinion of the son of Ptylus. But what reason shall I give Nicotis for declining the connection?" "The true one, of course," Ameres said in surprise. "What other reason could there be? In respect to position no objection could arise, nor upon that of wealth. He is an only son, and although Ptylus may not have so large an income as myself, for I have had much state employment, he can certainly afford to place his son in at least as good a position as we can expect for Mysa. Were we to decline the proposal without giving a reason, Ptylus would have good ground for offense. I do not suppose, Amense, he will be pleased at fault being found with his son, but that we cannot help. Parents cannot expect others to see their offspring with the same eyes that they do. I should certainly feel no offense were I to propose for a wife for Chebron to receive as an answer that he lacked some of the virtues the parents required in a husband for their daughter. I might consider that Chebron had those virtues, but if they thought otherwise, why should I be offended?"
"It is not everyone who sees matters as you do, Ameres, and no one likes having his children slighted. Still, if it is your wish that I should tell Nicotis that you have a personal objection to her son, of course I will do so." "Do not put it in that light, Amense. It is not that I have a personal objection to him. I certainly do not like him, but that fact has nothing to do with my decision. I might like him very much, and yet consider that he would not make Mysa a good husband; or on the other hand I might dislike him personally, and yet feel that I could safely entrust Mysa's happiness to him. You will say then to Nicotis that from what I have seen of Plexo, and from what I have learned of his character, it does not appear to me that a union between him and Mysa would be likely to conduce to her happiness, and that therefore I decline altogether to enter into negotiations for the bringing about of such a marriage."
Amense was well pleased, for she felt that this message, given in her husband's name, would be a great rebuff for her rival, and would far more than counterbalance the many triumphs she had gained over her by the recital of the number of banquets and entertainments in which she had taken part. Had Amense been present when Nicotis informed Ptylus of the refusal of their proposal for the hand of Mysa, she might have felt that even the satisfaction of mortifying a rival may be dearly purchased.
"You know the woman, Ptylus, and can picture to yourself the air of insolence with which she declined our proposal. I wished at the moment we had been peasants' wives instead of ladies of quality. I would have given her cause to regret her insolence for a long time. As it was as much as I could do to restrain myself, and to smile and say that perhaps after all the young people were not as well suited for each other as could be wished, and that we had only yielded to the wishes of Plexo, having in our mind another alliance which would in every respect be more advantageous. Of course she replied that she was glad to hear it, but she could not but know that I was lying, for the lotus flower I was holding in my hand trembled with the rage that devoured me.
"And it was, as you say, against Plexo personally that the objection was made?" Ptylus said gloomily.
So she seemed to say. Of course she would not tell me that she had set her mind on her daughter marrying one of the royal princes, though it is like enough that such is her thought, for the woman is pushing and ambitious enough for anything. She only said, in a formal sort of way, that while the alliance between the two families would naturally be most agreeable to them, her husband was of opinion that the dispositions of the young people were wholly dissimilar, and that he feared such a union would not be for the happiness of either, and that having perhaps peculiar ideas as to the necessity for husband and wife being of one mind in all matters, he thought it better that the idea should be abandoned. I had a mind to tell her that Ameres did not seem to have acted upon those ideas in his own case, for everyone knows that he and Amense have not a thought in common, that she goes her way and he goes his."
"Let them both beware," Ptylus said. "They shall learn that we are not to be insulted with impunity. This Ameres, whom the people regard as so holy, is at heart a despiser of the gods. Had he not been a favorite of Thotmes he would ere now have been disgraced and degraded, and I should be high priest in his place, for his son Neco is too young for such a dignity. But he is ascending in the scale, and every year that his father lives and holds office he will come more and more to be looked upon as his natural successor. A few more years and my chance will be extinguished."
"Then," Nicotis said decidedly, "Ameres must not hold office for many more years. We have talked the matter over and over again, and you have always promised me that some day I should be the wife of the high priest, and that Plexo should stand first in the succession of the office. It is high time that you carried your promises into effect."
"It is time, Nicotis. This man has too long insulted the gods by ministering at their services, when in his heart he was false to them. It shall be so no longer. This last insult to us decides me. Had he agreed to our proposal I would have laid aside my own claims, and with my influence could have secured that Plexo, as his son-in-law, should succeed rather than that shallow-brained fool Neco. He has refused the offer, and he must bear the consequences. I have been too patient. I will be so no longer, but will act. I have a strong party among the upper priesthood who have long been of my opinion that Ameres is a disgrace to our caste and a danger to our religion. They will join me heart and soul, for they feel with me that his position as high priest is an outrage to the gods. Ask me no questions, Nicotis, but be assured that my promises shall be kept. I will be high priest. Plexo shall marry this child he fancies, for his doing so will not only strengthen my position, but render his own succession secure, by silencing those who might at my death seek to bring back the succession to Neco."
"That is well, Ptylus. I have long wondered that you were content to be lorded over by Ameres. If I can aid you in any way, be sure that I will do so. By the way, Amense invited us to a banquet she is about to give next week. Shall we accept the invitation?"
"Certainly. We must not show that we are in any way offended at what has passed. As far as Ameres himself is concerned it matters not, for the man has so good an opinion of himself that nothing could persuade him that he has enemies. But it would not do, in view of what I have resolved upon, that any other should entertain the slightest suspicion that there exists any ill feeling between us." Great preparations were made by Amense for the banquet on the following week, for she had resolved that this should completely eclipse the entertainments of Nicotis. Ameres had, as usual, left everything in her hands, and she spared no expense. For a day or two previous large supplies of food arrived from the farm and from the markets in the city, and early on the morning of the entertainment a host of professional cooks arrived to prepare the dinner. The head cooks superintended their labors. The meat consisted of beef and goose, ibex, gazelle, and oryx; for although large flocks of sheep were kept for their wool, the flesh was not eaten by the Egyptians. There were, besides, great numbers of ducks, quails, and other small fowl. The chief cooks superintended the cutting up of the meat and the selection of the different joints for boiling or roasting. One servant worked with his feet a bellows, raising the fire to the required heat, another skimmed the boiling cauldrons with a spoon, and a third pounded salt, pepper, and other ingredients in a large mortar. Bakers and confectioners made light bread and pastry, the former being made in the form of rolls, sprinkled at the top with caraway and other seeds. The confectionery was made of fruit and other ingredients mixed with dough, and this was formed by a skillful workman into various artistic shapes, such as recumbent oxen, vases, temples, and other forms. Besides the meats there was an abundance of the most delicate kinds of fish. When the hour of noon approached Ameres and Amense took their seats on two chairs at the upper end of the chief apartment, and as the guests arrived each came up to them to receive their welcome. When all had arrived the women took their places on chairs at the one side of the hall, the men on the other. Then servants brought in tables piled up with dishes containing the viands, and in some cases filled with fruits and decorated with flowers, and ranged them down the center of the room. Cups of wine were then handed round to the guests, lotus flowers presented to them to hold in their hands, and garlands of flowers placed round their necks. Stands, each containing a number of jars of wine, stoppered with heads of wheat and decked with garlands, were ranged about the room. Many small tables were now brought in, and round these the guests took their seats upon low stools and chairs, the women occupying those on one side of the room, the men those on the other. The servants now placed the dishes on the small tables, male attendants waiting on the men, while the women were served by females. Egyptians were unacquainted with the use of knives and forks, the joints being cut up by the attendants into small pieces, and the guests helping themselves from the dishes with the aid of pieces of bread held between the fingers. Vegetables formed a large part of the meal, the meats being mixed with them to serve as flavoring, for in so hot a climate a vegetable diet is far more healthy than one composed principally of meat. While the meal was proceeding a party of female musicians, seated on the ground in one corner of the room, played and sang. The banquet lasted for a long time, the number of dishes served being very large. When it was half over the figure of a mummy, of about 3 feet in length, was brought round and presented to each guest in succession, as a reminder of the uncertainty of existence. But as all present were accustomed to this ceremony it had but little effect, and the sound of conversation and laughter, although checked for a moment, broke out again as soon as the figure was removed. Wine of many kinds was served during the dinner, the women as well as the men partaking of it. When all was concluded servants brought round golden basins with perfumed water and napkins, and the guests removed from their fingers the gravy that even with the daintiest care in feeding could not be altogether escaped. Then the small tables and stools were removed, and the guests took their places on the chairs along the sides of the room. Then parties of male and female dancers by turn came in and performed. Female acrobats and tumblers then entered, and went through a variety of performances, and jugglers showed feats of dexterity with balls and other tricks, while the musicians of various nationalities played in turns upon the instruments in use in their own countries. All this time the attendants moved about among the guests, serving them with wine and keeping them supplied with fresh flowers. A bard recited an ode in honor of the glories of King Thotmes, and it was not until late in the evening that the entertainment came to an end. "It has gone off splendidly," Amense said to Ameres when all was over, and the last guest had been helped away by his servants, for there were many who were unable to walk steadily unaided. "Nothing could have been better. It will be the talk of the whole town, and I could see Nicotis was devoured by envy and vexation. I do think great credit is due to me, Ameres, for you have really done nothing toward the preparations." "I am perfectly willing that you should have all the credit, Amense," Ameres said wearily, "and I am glad that you are satisfied. To me the whole thing is tedious and tiresome to a degree. All this superabundance of food, this too lavish use of wine, and the postures and antics of the actors and dancers is simply disgusting. However, if every one else was pleased, of course I am content." "You are the most unsatisfactory husband a woman ever had," Amense said angrily. "I do believe you would be perfectly happy shut up in your study with your rolls of manuscript all your life, without seeing another human being save a black slave to bring you in bread and fruit and water twice a day." "I think I should, my dear," Ameres replied calmly. "At any rate, I should prefer it vastly to such a waste of time, and that in a form to me so disagreeable as that I have had to endure today." Chapter 9: A Startling Event. It was some days later that Chebron and Amuba again paid a visit to the temple by moonlight. It was well nigh a month since they had been there, for, save when the moon was up, the darkness and gloom of the courts, lighted only by the lamps of the altars, was so great that the place offered no attractions. Amuba, free from the superstitions which influenced his companion, would have gone with him had he proposed it, although he too felt the influence of the darkness and the dim, weird figures of the gods, seen but faintly by the lights that burned at their feet. But to Chebron, more imaginative and easily affected, there was something absolutely terrible in the gloomy darkness, and nothing would have induced him to wander in the silent courts save when the moon threw her light upon them. On entering one of the inner courts they found a massive door in the wall standing ajar. "Where does this lead to?" Amuba asked. "I do not know. I have never seen it open before. I think it must have been left unclosed by accident. We will see where it leads to." Opening it, they saw in front of them a flight of stairs in the thickness of the wall. "It leads up to the roof," Chebron said in surprise. "I knew not there were any stairs to the roof, for when repairs are needed the workmen mount by ladders. Let us go up, Chebron. It will be curious to look down upon the courts." "Yes, but we must be careful, Amuba, for did any below catch sight of us, they might spread an alarm." "We need only stay there a minute or two," Amuba urged. "There are so few about that we are not likely to be seen, for if we walk noiselessly none are likely to cast their eyes so far upward." So saying, Amuba led the way up the stairs, and Chebron somewhat reluctantly followed him. They felt their way as they went, and after mounting for a considerable distance found that the stairs ended in a narrow passage, at the end of which was an opening scarce 3 feet high and just wide enough for a man to pass through. This evidently opened into the outer air, as sufficient light passed through to enable them to see where they were standing. Amuba crept out through the opening at the end. Beyond was a ledge a foot wide. Beyond that rose a dome, some 6 feet high and 8 or 10 feet along the ledge. "Come on, Chebron, there is plenty of room for both of us," he said, looking backward. Chebron at once joined him. "Where can we be?" Amuba asked. "There is the sky overhead. We are 20 feet from the top of the wall, and where this ledge ends, just before it gets to the sides of this stone, it seems to go straight down." Chebron looked round him. "This must be the head of one of the statues," he said after a pause. "What a curious place! I wonder what it can have been made for. See, there is a hole here." Just in front of them was an opening of some 6 inches in diameter in the stone. Amuba pushed his hand down. "It seems to go a long way down," he said, "but it is narrowing," and removing his arm he looked down the hole. "There is an opening at the other end," he said, "a small narrow slit. It must have been made to enable anyone standing here to see down, though I don't think they could see much through so small a hole. I should think, Chebron, if this is really the top of the head of one of the great figures, that slit must be where his lips are. Don't you think so?" Chebron agreed that it was probable. "In that case," Amuba went on, "I should say that this hole must be made to allow the priests to give answers through the mouth of the image to supplications made to it. I have heard that the images sometimes give answers to the worshippers. Perhaps this is the secret of it." Chebron was silent. The idea was a painful one to him, for if this were so, it was evident that trickery was practiced. "I think we had better go," he said at last. "We have done wrong in coming up here." "Let me peep over the side first," Amuba said. "It seems to me that I can hear voices below." But the projection of the head prevented his seeing anything beyond. Returning, he put his foot in the hole and raised himself sufficiently to get on the top of the stone, which was here so much flattened that there was no risk of falling off. Leaning forward, he looked over the edge. As Amuba had guessed would be the case, he found himself on the head of the principal idol in the temple. Gathered round the altar at its foot were 7 or 8 men, all of whom he knew by the whiteness of their garment to be priests. Listening intently, he could distinctly hear their words. After waiting a minute, he crawled back. "Come up here, Chebron. There is something important going on." Chebron joined him, and the two, lying close together, looked down at the court. "I tell you we must do away with him," one of the group below said in tones louder than had been hitherto used. "You know as well as I do that his heart is not in the worship of the gods. He has already shown himself desirous of all sorts of innovations, and unless we take matters into our hands there is no saying to what lengths he may go. He might shatter the very worship of the gods. It is no use to try to overthrow him openly, for he has the support of the king, and the efforts that have been made have not in any way shaken his position.
Therefore he must die. It will be easy to put him out of the way. There are plenty of small chambers and recesses which he might be induced to enter on some pretext or other, and then be slain without difficulty, and his body taken away by night and thrown into some of the disused catacombs. It would be a 9 days' wonder when he was missed, but no one could ever learn the truth of his disappearance. I am ready to kill him with my own hands, and should regard the deed as one most pleasing to the gods. Therefore, if you are ready to undertake the other arrangements, and 2 of you will join me in seeing that the deed is carried out without noise or outcry, I will take the matter in hand. I hate him, with his airs of holiness and his pretended love for the people. Besides, the good of our religion requires that he shall die." There was a chorus of approbation from the others. "Leave me to determine the time and place," the speaker went on, "and the excuse on which we will lead him to his doom. Those who will not be actually engaged with me in the business must be in the precincts of the place, and see that no one comes that way, and make some excuse or other should a cry by chance be heard, and must afterward set on foot all sorts of rumors to account for his actions. We can settle nothing tonight, but there is no occasion for haste, and on the 3rd night hence we will again gather here." Chebron touched Amuba, and the 2 crept back to where they had been standing on the ledge. "The villains are planning a murder in the very temple," Chebron said. "I will give them a fright," and applying his mouth to the orifice he cried, "Beware, sacrilegious wretches! Your plots shall fail and ruin fall upon you." "Come on, Chebron!" Amuba exclaimed, pulling his garment. "Some of the fellows may know the secret of this statue, and in that case they will kill us without mercy if they find us here." Passing through the opening they groped their way to the top of the stairs, hurried down these as fast as they could in the darkness, and issued out from the door. "I hear footsteps!" Amuba exclaimed as they did so. "Run for your life, Chebron!" Just as they left the court they heard the noise of angry voices and hurried footsteps close by. At full speed they ran through several courts and apartments. "We had better hide, Amuba." "It will be no use trying to do that. They will guard the entrance gates, give the alarm, and set all the priests on duty in the temple in search. No, come along quickly. They cannot be sure that it is we who spoke to them, and will probably wait until one has ascended the stairs to see that no one is lurking there. I think we are safe for the moment, but there are no good hiding places. I think you had better walk straight to the entrance, Chebron. Your presence here is natural enough, and those they post at the gates would let you pass out without suspicion. I will try and find myself a hiding place." "I certainly will not do that, Amuba. I am not going to run away and leave you in the scrape, especially as it was I who got us into it by my rashness." "Is there any place where workmen are engaged on the walls?" Amuba asked suddenly. "Yes, in the 3rd court on the right after entering," Chebron replied. "They are repainting the figures on the upper part of the wall. I was watching them at work yesterday." "Then in that case there must be some ladders. With them we might get away safely. Let us make for the court at once, but tread noiselessly, and if you hear a footstep approaching hide in the shadow behind the statue. Listen, they are giving the alarm. They know that their number would be altogether insufficient to search this great temple thoroughly." Shouts were indeed heard, and the lads pressed on toward the court Chebron had spoken of. The temple now was echoing with sounds, for the priests on duty, who had been asleep as usual when not engaged in attending to the lights, had now been roused by one of their number, who ran in and told them some sacrilegious persons had made their way into the temple. "Here is the place," Chebron said, stopping at the foot of the wall. Here 2 or 3 long light ladders were standing. Some of these reached part of the distance only up the walls, but the top of one could be seen against the skyline. "Mount, Chebron! There is no time to lose. They may be here at any moment." Chebron mounted, followed closely by his companion. Just as he gained the top of the wall several men carrying torches ran into the court and began to search along the side lying in shadow. Just as Amuba joined Chebron one of the searchers caught sight of them, and with a shout ran toward the ladder. "Pull, Chebron!" Amuba exclaimed as he tried to haul up the ladder. Chebron at once assisted him, and the foot of the ladder was already many feet above the ground before the men reached it. The height of the wall was some 50 feet, and light as was the construction of the ladder, it was as much as the lads could do to pull it up to the top. The wall was fully 12 feet in thickness, and as soon as the ladder was up, Amuba said:
Keep away from the edge, Chebron, or it is possible that in this bright moonlight we may be recognized. We must be going on at once. They will tie the short ladders together and be after us directly." "Which way shall we go?" "Toward the outer wall, as far as possible from the gate. Bring the ladder along." Taking it upon their shoulders they hurried along. Critical as the position was, Amuba could not help remarking on the singularity of the scene. The massive walls were all topped with white cement and stretched like broad ribbons, crossing and recrossing each other in regular parallelograms on a black ground. 5 minutes running took them to the outer wall, and the ladder was again lowered and they descended, and then stood at its foot for a moment to listen. Everything was still and silent. "It is lucky they did not think of sending men to watch outside the walls when they first caught sight of us, or we should have been captured. I expect they thought of nothing but getting down the other ladders and fastening them together. Let us make straight out and get well away from the temple, and then we will return to your house at our leisure. We had better get out of sight if we can before our pursuers find the top of the ladder. Then, as they will have no idea in which direction we have gone, they will give up the chase." After an hour's walking they reached home. On the way they had discussed whether or not Chebron should tell Ameres what had taken place, and had agreed that it would be best to be silent. "Your father would not like to know that you have discovered the secret of the image, Chebron. If it was not for that I should say you had best have told him. But I do not see that it would do any good now. We do not know who the men were who were plotting or whom they were plotting against. But one thing is pretty certain, they will not try to carry out their plans now, for they cannot tell how much of their conversation was overheard, and their fear of discovery will put an end for the present to this scheme of theirs." Chebron agreed with Amuba's views, and it was decided to say nothing about the affair unless circumstances occurred which might alter their intentions. They entered the house quietly and reached their apartment without disturbing any of the inmates. On the following morning one of the priests of the temple arrived at an early hour and demanded to see Ameres. "I have evil tidings to give you, my lord," he said. "Your son Neco has this morning been killed."
"Neco killed?"
Ameres repeated.
"It is, alas, but too true, my lord. He left the house where he lives with 2 other priests but a short distance from the gate of the temple at his usual hour. It was his turn to offer the sacrifices at dawn, and it must have been still dark when he left the house. As he did not arrive at the proper time a messenger was sent to fetch him, and he found him lying dead but a few paces from his own door, stabbed to the heart." Ameres waved his hand to signify that he would be alone, and sat down half stunned by the sudden shock. Between himself and his eldest son there was no great affection. Neco was of a cold and formal disposition, and although Ameres would in his own house have gladly relaxed in his case, as he had done in that of Chebron, the rigid respect and deference demanded by Egyptian custom on the part of sons toward their father, Neco had never responded to his advances and had been punctilious in all the observances practiced at the time. Except when absolutely commanded to do so, he had never taken a seat in his father's presence, had never addressed him unless spoken to, had made his appearance only at stated times to pay his respects to him, and when dismissed had gladly hurried away to the priest who acted as his tutor. As he grew up, the gap had widened instead of closing. Ameres saw with regret that his mind was narrow and his understanding shallow, that in matters of religion he was bigoted, while at the same time he perceived that his extreme zeal in the services of the temple, his absorption in ceremonial observances of all kinds, were due in no slight degree to ambition, and that he was endeavoring to obtain reputation for distinguished piety with a view to succeeding some day to the office of high priest. He guessed that the eagerness with which Neco embraced the first opportunity of withdrawing himself from his home and joining 2 other young priests in their establishment was due to a desire to dissociate himself from his father, and thus to make an unspoken protest against the latitude of opinion that had raised up a party hostile to Ameres. Although living so close it was very seldom that he had, after once leaving the house, again entered it, generally choosing a time when his father was absent and so paying his visits only to his mother. Still the news of his sudden death was a great shock, and Ameres sat without moving for some minutes until a sudden outburst of cries in the house betokened that the messenger had told his tidings to the servants, and that these had carried them to their mistress. Ameres at once went to his wife's apartment and endeavored to console her,
but wholly without success. Amense was frantic with grief. Although herself much addicted to the pleasures of the world, she had the highest respect for religion, and the ardor of Neco in the discharge of his religious duties had been a source of pride and gratification to her. Not only was it pleasant to hear her son spoken of as one of the most rising of the young priesthood, but she saw that he would make his way rapidly and would ere long become the recognized successor to his father's office. Chebron and Mysa bore the news of their brother's death with much more resignation. For the last 3 years they had scarcely seen him, and even when living at home there had been nothing in common between him and them. They were indeed more awed by the suddenness of his death than grieved at his loss. When he left them Ameres went at once to the house of Neco to make further inquiries into the matter. There he could learn nothing that could afford any clue. Neco had been late at the temple and had not returned until long after the rest of the household were in bed, and none had seen him before he left in the morning. No sound of a struggle or cry for help had been heard. His death had apparently been instantaneous. He had been stabbed in the back by someone who had probably been lurking close to the door, awaiting his coming out. The general opinion there and in the temple was that he must have fallen victim to a feeling of revenge on the part of some attendant in the building who on his report had undergone disgrace and punishment for some fault of carelessness or inattention in the service or in the care of the sacred animals. As a score of attendants had at one time or other been so reported by Neco, for he was constantly on the lookout for small irregularities, it was impossible to fix the crime on one more than another. The magistrates, who arrived soon after Ameres to investigate the matter, called the whole of those who could be suspected of harboring ill will against Neco to be brought before them and questioned as to their doings during the night. All stoutly asserted that they had been in bed at the time of the murder, and nothing occurred to throw a suspicion upon one more than another. As soon as the investigation was concluded, Ameres ordered the corpse to be brought to his own house. Covered by white cloths it was placed on a sort of sledge. This was drawn by 6 of the attendants of the temple. Ameres and Chebron followed behind, and after them came a procession of priests. When it arrived at the house, Amense and Mysa, with their hair unbound and falling around them, received the body, uttering loud cries of lamentation, in which they were joined by all the women of the house. It was carried into an inner apartment, and there until evening a loud wailing was kept up, many female relatives and friends coming in and joining in the outcry. Late in the evening the body was taken out, placed upon another sledge, and followed by the male relatives and friends and by all the attendants and slaves of the house, was carried to the establishment of Chigron the embalmer. During the 40 days occupied by the process the strictest mourning was observed in the house. No meat or wheaten bread was eaten, nor wine served at the table. Even the luxury of the bath was abandoned. All the males shaved their eyebrows, and sounds of loud lamentation on the part of the women echoed through the house. At the end of that time the mummy was brought back in great state, and placed in the room which was in all large Egyptian houses set apart for the reception of the dead. The mummy case was placed upright against the wall. Here sacrifices similar to those offered at the temple were made. Ameres himself and a number of the priests of the rank of those decorated with leopard skins took part in the services. Incense and libation were offered. Amense and Mysa were present at the ceremony, and wailed with their hair in disorder over their shoulders and dust sprinkled on their heads. Oil was poured over the head of the mummy, and after the ceremony was over Amense and Mysa embraced the mummied body, bathing its feet with their tears and uttering expressions of grief and praises of the deceased. In the evening a feast was held in honor of the dead. On this occasion the signs of grief were laid aside, and the joyful aspect of the departure of the dead to a happy existence prevailed. A large number of friends and relatives were present. The guests were anointed and decked with flowers, as was usual at these parties, and after the meal the mummy was drawn through the room in token that his spirit was still present among them. Amense would fain have kept the mummy for some time in the house, as was often the practice, but Ameres preferred that the funeral should take place at once. 3 days later the procession assembled and started from the house. First came servants bearing tables laden with fruit, cakes, flowers, vases of ointment, wine, some young geese in a crate for sacrifice, chairs, wooden tables, napkins, and other things. Then came others carrying small closets containing the images of the gods. They also carried daggers, bows, sandals, and fans, and each bore a napkin upon his shoulder. Then came a table with offerings and a chariot drawn by a pair of horses, the charioteer driving them as he walked behind the chariot. Then came the bearers of a sacred boat and the mysterious eye of Horus, the god of stability. Others carried small images of blue pottery representing the deceased under the form of Osiris, and the bird emblematic of the soul. Then 8 women of the class of paid mourners came along beating their breasts, throwing dust upon their heads, and uttering loud lamentations. Ameres, clad in a leopard skin, and having in his hands the censer and vase of libation, accompanied by his attendants bearing the various implements used in the services, and followed by a number of priests also clad in leopard skins, now came along. Immediately behind them followed the consecrated boat placed upon a sledge, and containing the mummy case in a large exterior case covered with paintings. It was drawn by 4 oxen and 7 men. In the boat Amense and Mysa were seated. The sledge was decked with flowers, and was followed by Chebron and other relatives and friends of the deceased, beating their breasts and lamenting loudly. When they arrived at the sacred lake, which was a large piece of artificial water, the coffin was taken from the small boat in which it had been conveyed and placed in the baris, or consecrated boat of the dead. This was a gorgeously painted boat with a lofty cabin. Amense, Mysa, and Chebron took their places here. It was towed by a large boat with sails and oars. The members of the procession then took their places in other richly decorated sailing boats, and all crossed the lake together. The procession was then reformed and went in the same order to the tomb. Here the mummy case was placed on the slab prepared for it, and a sacrifice with libation and incense offered. The door of the tomb was then closed but not fastened, as sacrificial services would be held there periodically for many years. The procession then returned on foot to the house. During all this time no certain clue had been obtained as to the authors of the murder. Upon going up to the temple on the day of Neco's death Chebron found all sorts of rumors current. The affair of the previous night had been greatly magnified, and it was generally believed that a strong party of men had entered the temple with the intention of carrying off the sacred vessels, but that they had been disturbed just as they were going to break into the subterranean apartments where these were kept, and had then fled to the ladders and escaped over the wall before a sufficient force could be collected to detain them. It was generally supposed that this affair was in some way connected with the death of Neco. Upon Chebron's return with this news he and Amuba agreed that it was necessary to inform Ameres at once of their doings on the previous night. After the evening meal was over Ameres called Chebron into his study. "Have you heard aught in the temple, Chebron, as to this strange affair that took place there last night? I cannot see how it can have any connection with your brother's death. Still it is strange. Have you heard who first discovered these thieves last night? Some say that it was Ptylus, though what he should be doing there at that hour I know not. 4 or 5 others are named by priests as having aroused them, but curiously not one of these is in the temple today. I have received a letter from Ptylus saying that he has been suddenly called to visit some relations living on the seashore near the mouths of the Nile. The others sent similar excuses. I have sent to their houses, but all appear to have left at an early hour this morning. This is most strange, for none notified to me yesterday that they had occasion to be absent. What can be their motive in thus running away, when naturally they would obtain praise and honor for having saved the vessels of the temple? Have you heard anything that would seem to throw any light upon the subject?" "I have heard nothing, father, but I can tell you much. I should have spoken to you the first thing this morning had it not been for the news about Neco." Chebron then related to Ameres how he and Amuba had the night before visited the temple, ascended the stairs behind the image of the god, and overheard a plot to murder some unknown person. "This is an extraordinary tale, Chebron," Ameres said when he had brought his story to a conclusion. "You certainly would have been slain had you been overtaken.
How the door that led to the staircase came to be open I cannot imagine. The place is only used on very rare occasions, when it is deemed absolutely necessary that we should influence in one direction or another the course of events. I can only suppose that when last used, which is now some months since, the door must have been carelessly fastened, and that it only now opened of itself. Still, that is a minor matter, and it is fortunate that it is you who made the discovery. As to this conspiracy you say you overheard, it is much more serious. To my mind the sudden absence of Ptylus and the others would seem to show that they were conscious of guilt. Their presence in the temple so late was in itself singular, and, as you say, they cannot know how much of their conversation was overheard. Against whom their plot was directed I can form no idea, though doubtless it was a personage of high importance."
"You do not think, father," Chebron said hesitatingly, "that the plot could have been to murder Neco? This is what Amuba and I thought when we talked it over this afternoon."
"I do not think so," Ameres said after a pause. "It is hardly likely that 4 or 5 persons would plot together to carry out the murder of one in his position. It must be someone of far greater importance. Neco may not have been liked, but he was certainly held in esteem by all the priests in the temple."
"You see, father," Chebron said, "that Ptylus is an ambitious man, and may have hoped at some time or other to become high priest. Neco would have stood in his way, for, as the office is hereditary, if the eldest son is fitted to undertake it, Neco would almost certainly be selected."
"That is true, Chebron, but I have no reason to credit Ptylus with such wickedness. Beside, he would hardly take other people into his confidence did he entertain such a scheme. Moreover, knowing that they were overheard last night, although they cannot tell how much may have been gathered by the listener, they would assuredly not have carried the plan into execution, besides which, as you say, no plan was arrived at, and after the whole temple was disturbed, they would hardly have met afterward and arranged this fresh scheme of murder. No, if Neco was killed by them, it must have been that they suspected that he was one of those who overheard them. His figure is not unlike yours. They may probably have obtained a glimpse of you on the walls, and have noticed your priest's attire. He was in the temple late, and probably left just before you were discovered. Believing then that they were overheard, and thinking that one of the listeners was Neco, they decided for their own safety to remove him. Of course it is mere assumption that Ptylus was one of those you overheard last night. His absence today is the only thing we have against him, and that alone is wholly insufficient to enable us to move in the matter. The whole affair is a terrible mystery. Be assured I will do my best to unravel it. At present, in any case, we can do nothing. Ptylus and the 4 priests who are absent will doubtless return when they find that no accusation is laid against them. They will suppose that the other person who overheard them, whoever he was, is either afraid to come forward, or perhaps heard only a few words, and is ignorant of the identity of the speakers. Indeed, he would be a bold man who would venture to prefer so terrible an accusation against 5 of the priests of the temple. I do not blame you in the matter, for you could not have foreseen the events that have happened. It was the will of the gods that you should have learned what you have learned. Perhaps they intend some day that you shall be their instrument for bringing the guilty to justice. As to the conspiracy, no doubt, as you say, the plot, against whomsoever it was directed, will be abandoned, for they will never be sure as to how much is known of what passed between them, and whether those who overheard them may not be waiting for the commission of the crown to denounce them. In the meantime you will on no account renew your visit to the temple, or enter it at any time, except when called upon to do so by your duties."
The very day after Neco's funeral Mysa and her mother were thrown into a flutter of excitement by a message which arrived from Bubastes. Some months before the sacred cat of the great temple there, a cat held in as high honor in Lower Egypt as the bull Apis in the Thebaid, had fallen sick, and in spite of the care and attendance lavished upon it, had died. The task of finding its successor was an important and arduous one, and, like the bull of Apis, it was necessary not only that the cat should be distinguished for its size and beauty, but that it should bear certain markings. Without these particular markings no cat could be elevated to the sacred post, even if it remained vacant for years. Therefore as soon as the cat was dead a party of priests set out from Bubastes to visit all the cities of Egypt in search of its successor. The whole country was agitated with the question of the sacred cat, and at each town they visited lists were brought to the priests of all the cats which, from size, shape, and color, could be considered as candidates for the office. As soon as one of the parties of the priests had reached Thebes, Amense had sent to them a description of Mysa's great cat Paucis. Hitherto Amense had evinced no interest whatever in her daughter's pets, seldom going out into the garden except to sit under the shade of the trees near the fountain for a short time in the afternoon when the sun had lost its power. In Paucis, indeed, she had taken some slight interest, because, in the first place, it was only becoming that the mistress of the house should busy herself as to the welfare of animals deemed so sacred, and in the second, because all who saw Paucis agreed that it was remarkable alike in size and beauty, and the presence of such a creature in the house was in itself a source of pride and dignity. Thus, then, she lost no time in sending a message to the priests, inviting them to call and visit her and inspect the cat. Although, as a rule, the competitors for the post of sacred Cat of Bubastes were brought in baskets by their owners for inspection, the priests were willing enough to pay a visit in person to the wife of so important a man as the high priest of Osiris. Amense received them with much honor, presented Mysa to them as the owner of the cat, and herself accompanied the priests in their visit to the home of Mysa's pets. Their report was most favorable. They had, since they left Bubastes, seen no cat approaching Paucis in size and beauty, and although her markings were not precisely correct, they yet approximated very closely to the standard. They could say no more than this, because the decision could not be made until the return of all the parties of searchers to Bubastes. Their reports would then be compared, and unless any one animal appeared exactly to suit all requirements, a visit would be made by the high priest of the temple himself to 3 or 4 of the cats most highly reported upon. If he found one of them worthy of the honor, it would be selected for the vacant position. If none of them came up to the lofty standard the post would remain unfilled for a year or two, when it might be hoped that among the rising generation of cats a worthy successor to the departed one might be found. For themselves they must continue their search in Thebes and its neighborhood, as all claimants must be examined, but they assured Amense that they thought it most improbable that a cat equal to Paucis would be found. Some months had passed, and it was not until a week after the funeral of Neco that a message arrived, saying that the report concerning Paucis by the priests who had visited Thebes was so much more favorable than that given by any of the other searchers of the animals they had seen, that it had been decided by the high priest that it alone was worthy of the honor. The messenger stated that in the course of a fortnight a deputation consisting of the high priest and several leading functionaries of the temple, with a retinue of the lower clergy and attendants, would set out from Bubastes by water in order to receive the sacred cat, and to conduct her with all due ceremony to the shrine of Bubastes. Mysa was delighted at the honor which had befallen her cat. Privately she was less fond of Paucis than of some of the less stately cats, for Paucis, from the time it grew up, had none of the playfulness of the tribe, but deported itself with a placid dignity which would do honor to its new position, but which rendered it less amusing to Mysa than its humbler but more active companions. Amense was vastly gratified at the news. It was considered the highest honor that could befall an Egyptian for one of his animals to be chosen to fill the chief post in one of the temples, and next in dignity to Apis himself was the sacred cat of the great goddess, known as Basti, Bubastes, or Pasht. As soon as the news was known, all the friends and acquaintances of the family flocked in to offer their congratulations, and so many visits were paid to Mysa's inclosure that even the tranquillity of Paucis was disturbed by the succession of admirers, and Amense, declaring that she felt herself responsible for the animal being in perfect health when the priests arrived for it, permitted only the callers whom she particularly desired to honor to pay a visit of inspection to it.